My name is Lloyd Kaplan, and I'm here to talk about Rhode Island Jazz and its origins. A lot of people ask about how Rhode Island Jazz got started, and a lot of people wonder why Rhode Island, of all the states, has produced so many wonderful jazz musicians. And these are a few of my thoughts. I think it began as a result of technology. I think that in 1917, the first jazz record was produced, and this was a record that featured the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And once that record hit, it became popular, and it was available for people anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world for that matter. And it was very important because people anywhere could hear what jazz sounded like now. And this was a wonderful step forward in popularizing this kind of music. And another major factor, again with technology, was the fact that in 1925 network radio came alive. And when it first came on the scene, it was a wonderful opportunity. It provided wonderful opportunities for many jazz musicians and vocalists because the station owners wanted to be able to fill the airways, and they did so primarily with music. So there were all kinds of opportunities for musicians, for singers, and so forth. And now the new music was becoming popular over the air and through the phonograph records. And now in Rhode Island, there was a heavy Italian population, and that was a major factor because the Italian families believed in music. They loved music. The history of Italy is dominated almost by their contributions to music. And so it was a natural thing for the offspring of these first generation Italians to come in to want to feature music as part of their educations. They made a big deal of it. And so now the new music is being played either on recordings or on the radio, and there's a vast population of Italians, and the young Italian kids were interested in this new music. It was so exciting compared to some of the music that preceded it. And so that was one of the major reasons why it all came together in Rhode Island. Another major factor here is the density of the population of this state. These young people who were starting to take up jazz, not only Italians now, but other groups of people, Irish people, Jewish people, French, Portuguese. They were all into the new music, and they were living close. They were living. Rhode Island was the most densely populated state in the whole entire country until just a few years ago, when it was replaced by New Jersey. But the thing is, the density of the population made it possible for the young musicians to hear one another play, to join bands, to get together with other people. They might have neighbors next door or upstairs or across the street, whatever. There were always musicians for these young musicians to associate with because of the density, the closeness of the living quarters there. And another thing is that there were many clubs. There were many clubs in many neighborhoods. And so that these clubs provided opportunities for this growing young group of musicians, so that they could get into playing. Once they got playing their instruments, they had an outlet. They had a chance to break into performing, and so this became very important. They could listen to other groups perform, and that was important, so that they could learn, and they could also try out their material. And this was also important because when you're learning jazz, and when you're trying to develop at jazz, you have to keep doing it in order to gain confidence, in order to develop the confidence in your own abilities. And the more you do it, the more likely you are to succeed at it. And so these clubs provided essentially a farm system for the young budding musicians. And they would be at all levels. At the beginning level, it was like an A, double A, triple A, and so forth, until you reach the major leagues. So these are important factors, excuse me, as to why some of the jazz developed in Rhode Island. There was also another factor, and that was the proximity of Rhode Island to Boston and to New York. Veritable hotbeds of jazz, and they weren't all that far for young musicians to travel to and hear what was really new, what was really happening. So this was a major, these are all contributing factors that made up the wonderful development of jazz in Rhode Island. What got me started in this history of Rhode Island jazz was the fact that many musicians who I early on had associated with used to talk about the old timers who had played and had played so wonderfully, and there were so many of them, and I know that I didn't know most of them, and this was in the 1960s and thereabouts, and even in the 1970s. And the thing is, I figured if I didn't know them, and I'm a musician, then a lot of other people who are not musicians are not going to remember these people. And so around the time of 1988, I was ready for a sabbatical from the Community College of Rhode Island, and that's when I decided that I would look into the study of some of these early musicians, because I wanted to know more about them and to find out who was important among them and why they became what they became and so forth. And so that's when I decided to indulge in a study, and I was granted the sabbatical for half a year. And I was fortunate enough to have a wonderful bass player by the name of Bob Petteruti join me in this project. And he has a tremendous knowledge of history. He marks down every job that he notates information about every job that he's played, and he's played for almost 50 years. So he was a great asset in the project. And together we interviewed several musicians from different communities, Sam Sherman from Woonsocket, people from Newport, people from Pawtucket, different areas of the state, and asked them to name as many musicians as could be, as they could recall, who they thought were important. And so that's how we got started, and it was very informative because a lot of names came up that I never knew anything about, and names like, John Azevedo, I had never heard of such a person, Alphonse Antonelli, a pianist that they say was incredible, and of course we had all heard of Frankie Carl, a wonderful band leader and composer, and Johnny Beattini. These are names that I wasn't all that familiar with. Pete Kalaluka he was a clarinetist, and he started a Dixieland band that eventually became taken over by Tony Tommaso, the greatest, one of the very, very greatest I've ever heard. Tony Tommaso, the cornet player, who led the Jewels of Dixie. And there were so many players, and this became fascinating. So Bob and I put together a study of, I think there were 260 so or thereabouts, little biographies of these musicians. And we didn't want to exclude any musicians that were considered jazz musicians. So we didn't only go with the stars like Bobby Hackett and Dave McKenna, but we went with all the jazz musicians. And we put down those bios. It was much in the same format as the Leonard Feather Encyclopedia of Jazz. It's the same format used. And along with that, along with the bios, we included an overview of Rhode Island jazz and how it fit into the jazz jazz as it happened nationally and internationally. And it became more and more fascinating as we went along. This was all in the book, Who's Who in Rhode Island Jazz. I forgot to mention that. So it became interesting as we thought more and more about the clubs, the wonderful clubs that emerged, like the Celebrity Club, which was one of the...
Just for a second. I'm noticing something about the lighting that I really didn't pick up before. I just want to...
Okay.
The clubs and, yeah. Do you want... yeah, just start talking about...
It was interesting when we got to this to consider the Celebrity Club. We found out that it was the first interracial club in Rhode Island, and this was a major contribution to the culture and the society in general. And Paul Filippi should be commended for that. Should have been commended for that major contribution. And it was an incredibly wonderful club in terms of the quality of jazz that it provided. I know from personal experience, I saw the entire Duke Ellington band there, and I saw Stan Getz, and that's the type of... Yeah, I also had the pleasure of seeing Earl Bostick. It was loaded with talent and the entertainment. The groups that performed there would perform there for an entire week. They didn't come in for just a one performance deal. It was an ongoing thing, and they had an opening band there. Sometimes it was I believe it was Mike Renzi with Bob Pederuti and Artie Cabral and so forth. So it was wonderful, and it was so highly rated. One person that we talked to said that it had been rated by Metronome magazine as the 4th best jazz club in the entire North America, only behind the Blue Note or a couple of others, one in Toronto and so forth. So it was highly, highly regarded and highly respected. And it was a colorful place there. It was just a lot of fun. And there were other clubs too that were like the Ranch Club, which featured a house band comprised of Nick DeQuilla, who was one of the greatest of all jazz guitarists. He was magnificent. He went big time with some band, and he was a featured artist. And he was, I believe, the first in Rhode Island to play the electric guitar. So he was really quite an important figure. So there were lots of things happening in terms of clubs, in terms of, and then the festival came along, 1954, and and that was like gangbusters. It brought Rhode Island into the to the attention of the world, because it was such an innovation to have such a magnificent type of venue for all these jazz musicians. They not only played in concert, but they played in jam sessions together. They had forums where they discussed jazz, and they had improvisation sessions, and it was all kinds of lively things happening. It wasn't just a one concert deal, and then you go home. It was an ongoing thing for an entire weekend, and it was a great contribution to jazz throughout the world, because the concept of the festival took off. Obviously, it's all over the world now. Festivals, and nowadays, for the jazz musician, that the festival is probably one of the main sources of income for these people, along with the residuals that some musicians get. Not all. The other aspect of it was that you could not only hear jazz in clubs and in various other places and festivals and so forth, but you heard it over the radio a great deal, and it was almost the popular music at one time. In fact, essentially it was. And some of the great DJs that came along, who were so important in spreading the word and popularizing the music, there were three giants that I'm aware of, and one of them was Fred Grady. Fred Grady was extremely important and well liked. There was Carl Henry, who had a music store as well, called Carl's Diggins on North Main Street in Providence. He was wonderful. And Jim Mendes. Jim Mendes was a wonderful DJ as well. Jim Mendes, by the way, was black. He was an African American, and he, along with Sam Jackson. Sam Jackson was one of the pioneers, and he was perhaps the first black DJ to be well known as far as playing jazz a great deal. And he's the father of Eric Jackson, the present DJ on WGBH FM in Boston. And so you heard it in clubs, you heard it festivals, you heard it on the radio all the time, and a lot of people. These were the 30s and the 40s, the 30s especially, and up until the end of World War II. These were Depression years, and people did not have the money, generally speaking, to go out and spend a lot for entertainment. So they got a lot of wonderful, wonderful jazz material played free of charge on the radio. And so the DJs became of very great importance to the propagation of jazz music in this country and in the state. I mentioned Carl's Diggins, and that was a cute little shop. It was like a tiny little place with thousands of records, and Carl was always there. And in fact, he did live broadcasts for a while, right from the store, from that little dinky store. People came in, and he asked them questions, and he gave them records as prizes and so forth. So it was a nice institution. There were other shops around. There were other stores, record shops, and there was a big one on North Main Street, and I can't remember I can't remember the name of that particular store. but it was one of the big ones, and there were others. There was one in Pawtucket, and oh my gosh, I can't remember the name.
Okay, that's okay.
Oh, what was the name? Oh man, boy, that I hadn't thought about that. I don't have a good answer for that, to be honest with you. I don't really. I'm sure there must have been promotions at times, but I don't recall a great deal of emphasis in the record shops. The DJs on the other hand would do a lot to promote the local artists. Fred Grady did a lot to promote the local artists. He was especially very fond of the music of the young Hal Crook, the trombonist, who now heads the improvisation department at Berklee College in Boston. And in fact, Hal, to reflect his love for Fred Grady, composed a work, and I can't recall the title, but it was dedicated to him, and it has something about him in the title. But the DJs did do a lot to promote local jazz, and to promote they did advertising for upcoming programs, or who was performing and so forth. I can't recall any local magazines that were dedicated to jazz. I can't. I know that the musicians would read Downbeat. Downbeat for a long time was a very, very popular magazine for musicians. And Rhode Islanders, as well as people all over the country, would read Downbeat. And that would have good articles about different musicians, and it would list where the bands and artists were performing and so forth. So that was an important source. And then they would have their polls, and that would be fun to see who would come out as the best sax player and so forth. But I can't remember any local magazines as such. There's the national, the Musicians Union turns out a magazine, a publication, but there wasn't anything local that I can recall. Maybe there was, but I wasn't aware of it. I've never been aware of such. And that's one of the things that also prompted me and Bob Pederuti to write this book, The Who's Who in Rhode Island Jazz, because we couldn't recall very much having been done along those lines. There had been a book, a little booklet done about the Newport Jazz Festival, and but I don't think it's available now. It was more of a pamphlet than a genuine book, but it was very informative. But I don't think it's available. Oh yeah. Well, the clubs, there were other clubs. I had only mentioned a few, but one of the other major clubs that featured jazz was Bovie's. A fellow by the name of John Bovie, B-O-V-I, owned the club in East Providence, and not a huge place, but a big enough, and I believe, I was told that Red McDonald led a group there, and he was the pioneering group to go in there and have jam sessions. I think it was on Sundays, and I know for a long time Tony Tommaso and his Jewels of Dixie played at Bovie's, and then Duke Belair's band, the big band of Duke Belair, came in, and they played every Monday night for I don't know how many years, more than 20, I believe, and the musicians would it it forced the musicians union to change their rules to accommodate such a large band performing in a small place because of the finances involved, so that musicians would get paid less, but they did it for the love of the music, and it gave them a chance to get together and be with each other and perform genuine big band jazz. So Duke Belair led a band for many years at Bovie's. Now there's a wonderful big band performing still every Monday night at Bovie's. Bovie's, it used to be called Bovie's Town Tavern, but I think it's just Bovie's now. But this is led by John Allmark, who originally was born in England but has come over here. He's a great trumpet player, and he has a sensational big band playing every Monday night. So there was Bovie's. There were several other clubs, and they featured artists, guest artists. Pee Wee Russell would come in for a week and perform with Tony Tommaso's group, for example, and I know Bob Pederuti played with Ben Webster when he was part of the house band. Ben Webster came in for a week, and many artists would come in. At the Ranch House, led by Nick DeQuilla, Frank Marchetti was their bass player, and many artists would come there. And Stephen Edie Gourmet, for example, or a young Tony Bennett, and I'm trying to think of the clarinet player's name, Buddy. I can't remember his last name. DeFranco? Buddy DeFranco. Thanks. Buddy DeFranco and several artists of that caliber would come in and spend an entire week and perform with these local musicians. And they wouldn't bring their own players. They didn't need to, because the house musicians in this state were solid, were good enough to provide more than an adequate background for these performers. Oh, Duke Belair was a part of the house band at the Celebrity Club as well, yeah. I can't remember all the different combinations because it went on for quite a few years, and I think that they would switch every few years or something like that. So if somebody went out of town to work with another band or something of that sort, that's the way that would go. And Rhode Island has produced many great jazz musicians who became stars on the national and international scene. And the first one of those was the great Bobby Hackett. He was magnificent as a cornet player, and he also played guitar. And he worked for Glenn Miller, and he worked a great deal with Louis Armstrong. He was one of Louis Armstrong's favorite performers, and he would oftentimes have him play second trumpet to him on recordings and such. And then Dave McKenna became a gigantic star as the great left-handed playing pianist, jazz pianist, a great stride artist who also was modern with his right hand. Scott Hamilton became a major figure. Harry Allen has become a major figure on the tenor sax. So many performers have become big time. Greg Abate is now becoming a major force as a bop star on the alto sax and other instruments as well. He's played other instruments, flute and so forth. So many of the players, but some of the players remained here in the state for various reasons, family reasons or whatever reasons. Some of them just didn't like being on the road. And so you have some great musicians like Art Pelosi was the master performer of Rhode Island Jazz for many years. He was truly the master, I thought, and he along with Tony Tommaso and Porky Cohen, who had been on the road for a while with Roomful of Blues and other big bands in his earlier days. But some of the players stayed in Rhode Island. Some of them went over and went national. Another interesting performer from Rhode Island, one who I've come to appreciate all the more in time, is George Masso, a brilliant trombonist as well as a great pianist and an arranger. He's overall just a brilliant musician. And George Masso played with Benny Goodman. He played with a group called the World's Greatest Jazz Band. He played with them. He played Bob Crosby. He played with so many great musicians. He did part of the score for a film called The Gig. And this was a wonderful film about jazz musicians. And you don't see George in the film itself, but he played the trombone, all the trombone parts. But now he's back in Rhode Island, and he's playing locally here and there, and as well as doing the festivals. Periodically, he will leave the country to do festivals. So he is a great trombonist. There were so many figures you could talk about one after the other.
Take a break.
Break time.
A lot of musicians that were good enough to go national and international maybe didn't, and they stayed close to home, and maybe that's part of the Italian thing or the
family.
All the family being here. I mean, did you find that to be a theme as you kind of collected and wrote all these biographies of musicians?
I think so. Some of the guys would go on the road for a short time. Some of the musicians what did go, who were very talented, would go nationally. They would travel. They would do the thing. They would sow their oats, so to speak, musically. People like Porky Cohen would go with the Roomful of Blues to Japan and so forth, but he would be so tired from it all. He was at an elderly age at that time, and Art Pelosi had gone to Las Vegas, I believe, and performed with Dinah Washington and so forth. They would do their things. They would have that experience. Frank Marchetti is another one who traveled quite a bit with Al Conti and so forth. But the family situation would require them to somehow want to return to Rhode Island and lead a more normal, everyday type of existence. Rather, because it wasn't easy, it wasn't glamorous all the time, being on the road, and that's what you would hear from the different musicians. And the same thing happened with George Masso, who had gone with different groups and so forth, would come home periodically, I believe. Others as well. Trying to think of who might be included in that group. It's not coming to me. And some people want to know what jazz is, and that's a very difficult thing to define, and everyone who defines it has a different slant on what it is. They all see things from a little different perspective. But as I see it, jazz is a type of American music that had been created by American blacks, and it is characterized by the following things. It's characterized by lots of improvisation, and very importantly, a loose rhythmic approach. A loose rhythmic approach. That's what I like to stress. It isn't just syncopation alone, but it's loosening that syncopation, and that's what really gives it its characteristics. And a constant beating out of the tempo, I see as very important. So I think that's the way I would define it. A type of American music started by American blacks, and it started around around 1900 roughly. It started actually evolving so many decades before that, but it finalized sometime around 1900, and it really crystallized in a place called Storyville, that notorious red light district of New Orleans, which opened up in 1897 and became an official district, red light district around that time, and it lasted until 1917. So it was a 20-year period, and it was a place. The jazz musicians did not play in houses of prostitution, but they played in the dance halls of that district, and they played in the drinking houses of that district. And this is where people like Kid Ory and Louis Armstrong and the Dodds brothers and all of these people, these great old-time musicians who started jazz, really started the whole process, started to play music where they improvised. I think I forgot to mention improvisation. I think I did mention it. But they started to improvise the material, the songs of the day, which would include blues songs, which would include ragtime songs, rags, and popular songs of the day, and some of the marches that they heard, some of the hymns. They would elaborate upon these songs, and they would primarily play for dancing in these little tiny clubs in New Orleans, in that red light district known as Storyville, named after one of the politicians by the name of Sidney Story. And that's the story.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
But one of the things I forgot to mention when I talked about musicians on the road was the fact that there were a lot of temptations. There were lots of temptations out there. The first question that if musicians are playing in a club, for example, the first question that anyone asks when they come over to a musician is, "Can I get you a drink?" And invariably, the club owners want the musicians to accept the offer so that they can sell more liquor, of course. And many musicians did indeed become alcoholics on the road. And there were so many temptations. It wasn't only the alcoholic situation, but it was drugs. And many times, musicians on the road would not have very much time between their jobs, between their gigs, and so forth. And as a result, they'd be traveling all night, and then after a performance, they would hit the road sometimes, and then have to head for the next location where they were playing, and then they would have to get up for that. They would have to get themselves charged up for that performance. And that's what led to a lot of musicians taking drugs to get themselves charged up artificially, and this led to a lot of addictions and early deaths in some cases. One of the prime examples was the example of Bix Beiderbecke, who, not as a drug addict, but as an alcoholic. He and Pee Wee Russell were the best of buddies, and they drank each other under the table half the time. And Bix died, unfortunately, at the age of 28, and it was an incredible loss. And even when he went to recording sessions, and I'm sure that he was not the only one that was in the situation, but even when he was at a recording session, he would typically go with a flask, or he would have a glass of gin or vodka, which was clear, and people would assume that it was water. Or so, but he was unfortunately an out-and-out alcoholic, and so many were. Pee Wee Russell was an alcoholic before he was in his teens, and the same thing happened with Stan Getz and others. And a lot of times it happened to young musicians, because young musicians, when they wanted to impress the older musicians with whom they worked, they would try to show off by showing how much they could drink and that sort of thing. And that's when they started to have tendencies to excessive drinking, and that's what led to Stan Getz's difficulties in his early days, and because he was a teenage star. And this is what would happen, I'm sure, frequently with others as well. Well, segregation on the road, this was always a major, this was a long-time problem. The African-American musician had a great deal of difficulty, obviously, when traveling south. He would also have trouble in the north and the northeast as well, but it was more intensified in the south, and these musicians had a tough time finding sleeping accommodations, eating accommodations, and so forth. Many of them had to sleep on trains and eat their meals there and so forth. Even getting a drink at a water fountain was a source of difficulty. They would sometimes have to be escorted by police to the water fountain, and so it was a very, very difficult thing. And some of the musicians, for example, the vocalists, if they were light-colored in skin, and they were performing with a dark-skinned band, an African-American band, but basically very dark skin, they would be asked to put makeup on to darken their own face so that it wouldn't look like a white vocalist was, a female vocalist was working with a black band. This was unheard of, and so they asked them to darken up. This was done with the great Billie Holiday, for example, and so there were lots of troubles. And in Rhode Island, there was still prejudice for a long time, until maybe after the Civil Rights Movement. The main example that I heard about was the example of when Benny Goodman came to town, came to Providence. He was staying at the Biltmore Hotel, and I think it was Nick DeQuilla's band. His group was playing downstairs in the Biltmore Hotel, and Nick DeQuilla, as I said before, was a great guitarist, and Benny Goodman wanted to sit in with Nick DeQuilla, and in fact he did. But Charlie Christian, who was with him, wasn't allowed out of his room at the Biltmore Hotel at that particular time, and he wasn't allowed to come down and sit in on the jam session. So that was an outrageous example of prejudice there. As great as Charlie Christian was, a famous reputation, national, international reputation, he couldn't do it. And I'm sure there are dozens and dozens of other cases that duplicate the same kind of story. Bobby Hackett was a wonderful player and a wonderful human being. He had everything that it took to be a megastar, except he didn't have the charisma. He was not an outgoing type of person, but he had everything else. He had the fantastic ear. Because he had been a guitarist and because he had played the chords and was so familiar with chord progressions from playing the guitar, he always knew where he was going musically, and he could solo, he could improvise so beautifully and so tastefully. It's oftentimes a case of taste. It isn't always a case of how many notes people play. But it's a case of musical taste and beauty, and that's what Bobby Hackett had. He had musical taste, and he provided beauty in his jazz, and he had that beautiful sound on the cornet. And his model, his great inspiration was Louis Armstrong, and yet he sounded to me more like Bix Beiderbecke, because he played kind of a soft, mellow, laid-back sound for the most part. And I think he is the father of Rhode Island jazz. He was the first jazz figure to make it so big nationally and internationally. And as I said before, he worked with Louis Armstrong. He was loved by Louis Armstrong, and he was loved by Dizzy Gillespie, and he was loved by Miles Davis. I mean, from all these generations, from all these different styles, come people loving the type of work that Bobby Hackett was able to provide. And Hackett played with such perfection that when he was with the Glenn Miller Band and he played some of his wonderful solos, they would be the notation would be taken so that every note of the solo would be written down, and players after that had to play that particular solo that Hackett had created on the spur of the moment. So he was just a genius, I think, and he was also a character. He had a great wit about him, and of course there are many stories about him. But one of the famous stories is that when he was selling his horn, somebody asked him if it was new. And he said, or if it was used, and he said, not the upper register, because he preferred not to go for the sensational, extreme notes on the high register, but within the body of the notes that are beautiful, and the range, I should say. So he was quite a character, from what I hear. A humble person, and I think he helped some of the other Rhode Islanders. I think he helped get the career of Dave McKenna rolling. I think he was a good friend of Dave McKenna, and he helped him, and I think he helped others. That's what I have heard.
Did he stay close? I mean, did he come back to Rhode Island often, do you know, or did he stay?
No, he settled after he got through playing most of the New York spots, and he played for a long time with Eddie Condon's group and so forth in New York. He settled at the Cape, and he just settled there for the last part of his life, and he stayed there, and he performed for several years. I can't think of the exact town in which he was when he performed at the Cape, but that's where he settled. He didn't come back to Rhode Island. The wonderful thing about the Celebrity Club and the contribution made by Paul Filippi was, of course, the bringing of the races together. And it wasn't a case of the African American had to sit on this side or the whites had to sit on this side. It was all mixed. You sat where you wanted, and it didn't matter. And it was one of the beautiful experiences that I had as a young man when I went there, and I did get to mingle with African Americans. It hadn't happened before that. I had never even thought of it, but when I went to play in a band, it was all white. And it wasn't that the musicians were intentionally discriminating, but it just seemed to be that way. And when you went to a job, that's the way it was. One of the few exceptions was Eddie Soares. Eddie Soares was a black pianist, and he was hired, and he worked with a lot of the early jazz musicians, and he became a regular member of the Jewels of Dixie with Tony Tommaso's group. He was the pianist, and that was an interracial group as I think back to it now, and nobody ever thought anything about it. Eddie Soares was extremely popular, and with the public, nobody made any big deal out of it, and certainly the musicians didn't. So it was a beautiful thing to see how music can bring the races together, and when it happens, you don't even think about anything having to do with skin color or ethnic background or anything. You're just thinking about the music and the feeling that it provides, the healthy, wonderful exuberance that it engenders, basically.
Good, that was great. Any stories that seem typically Rhode Island that from the book, when you kind of were writing all the biographies and everything? Is there anything that you remember that stands out?
I could tell you some of it.
Come on, that's what we want.
Oh no, you know what? That one on tape.
We do.
But a lot of that, there could be just one little thing that it won't be like you're putting anybody down. There could be just one little thing out of that group of stuff that could be good, could be useful.
Oh.
I remember now. People make fun of themselves in the state too sometimes. So,
Trying to think.
with soccer, I lived up there. My grandmother was French Canadian.
Say it again?
My grandmother was French. Actually, she lived in Central Falls. I lived in Woonsocket for a lot of years. But there was the tenants were side by each then, and drive slow your car, you, and all that
What
stuff.
is that? Drive slow.
Drive slow your car, you. And I went to Newport. I was working for the Woonsocket Corps, and so I went there on a Friday night.
There were. Oh no! Don't you know?
Oh no, he did.
And Paul Gonzalez, that's one of the famous stories about him, is the time he fell off the bandstand. He was really drunk, and when he got back up, he started to play Ramona, which wasn't the song that the band was playing. It's an old waltz, and he got back, and he's playing Ramona of all songs. And he gets back on the stand, and Duke Ellington was so mad, he banged him on the head, and he fell down. And he looked up at him, and he says, "Duke, you play rough." And Duke Ellington broke out laughing, and that was the end. But that's the kind of situation. The only one of the unusual things that happened when I was playing, I arrived early to a job in Newport. It was at one of the mansions, and it was a band led by Ralph Stewart, who frequently played for Society occasions. And so I got there early. I forget the name of the mansion, but it overlooked the water. And so I was sitting there just waiting for other people to arrive. And hors d'oeuvres were being placed on the table, and a cover was put over it by the waitresses. And then they left. And all of a sudden, a seagull came down, picked up the tablecloth that covered and started to peck away at the hors d'oeuvres, and then the waiters and waitresses came and chased it away. But that was one of the unusual things that I witnessed. Some of the funny things would happen involve people who thought that they could sing, who oftentimes came up to the band, and they were oftentimes inebriated, and they wanted to sing some song, and they would be off meter and off key, and so those were usually lively experiences. As far as the future of jazz in Rhode Island goes, that's a difficult subject to tackle. It's hard to know where it's going to go. The schools are providing some wonderfully trained musicians. There's no question about it. The school jazz groups, the high school jazz groups, even junior high schools, middle schools are having jazz bands. So it's going on in all the schools and the colleges. CCRI has a jazz department and a jazz curriculum, which is excellent. And so does URI. URI is expanding a great deal. They've got a jazz studies program. And so there will be no shortage of jazz players, per se. But whether or not they're going to find the venue to start and develop and become their own musician, develop their own styles and so forth, try things out, that's another story. I'm not sure that there are enough places in Rhode Island for them to go out and develop and become top professionals. I would hope that that's the case, that there will be more clubs in the future. Maybe it will make a comeback, but as I see it right now, it's not happening. The only clubs that we know about are Bovie's, basically, in East Providence. Chan's, occasionally in Woonsocket, will have a jazz-oriented program, but it's not every single week jazz. And there's a club called the Hi-Hat, which has some jazz, but not. It's more rock than it is jazz. So it's tough to predict what the story will be in the future. I would certainly hope that things will come along so in like a circle, so that jazz musicians will be appreciated more and more, and other clubs will come along and open up. It remains to be seen. A lot of the jazz now, as far as I know, whatever little bit of jazz there is for small groups is in restaurants. I think that's one of the major venues for the new musician in jazz. But whether the new musician will adapt and perform a music that's suitable for the restaurant environment, that's another story, because some jazz musicians are amazingly aggressive in their styles, and if they go into a restaurant and people are expecting a laid-back, soft type of jazz, they're not oftentimes going to get it, and it's going to conflict.
Sorry, I had to get directions
Okay. Are you all done? Okay.
Keep going.
So that's how I see it. I'm not too clear on where it's going. There will be definitely, to reiterate, there will definitely be enough players around, because there are loads of players who would like to do it, but whether or not they will find places in which to do it remains to be seen.